Good afternoon. My name's Richard Freston. I'm from Lloyd's Register and I'm a project manager. I've been supporting this joint development project. I'm actually presenting really on behalf of my colleague Meg Dowling, who did the majority of work pulling together the final white paper here, but obviously with a substantial contribution from the Port of Rotterdam and other partners, Maersk and Core Power. So why does this matter? We've talked about this a fair bit today, I think, and in other forums. Shipping is under pressure to identify scalable zero-emission technologies that can meet increasingly demanding decarbonization requirements while preserving operational reliability, endurance, and flexibility. This JDP matters because it moves maritime nuclear from abstract discussion to focused and defined case study. A nuclear-powered feeder ship, calling it a major EU port within an assumed operating scenario and regulatory context. Ports are key stakeholders in international shipping trade, being the gateways for loading and discharging cargoes. For their own safety and in compliance with local requirements, ports are empowered to inspect and audit visiting ships to confirm they are operating safely and in compliance with local requirements. However, each port is different and adds local policy and politics to international trade regulations and must therefore be carefully considered when new potentially hazardous technologies are proposed in their jurisdictions. The work was intended to support ports, regulators, ship owners, technology developers, and other stakeholders in understanding the steps required to move nuclear ships from conceptual to operational readiness. It shows that existing risk-based port safety frameworks provide a credible starting point, and that the challenge centers on regulatory alignment, governance, risk management integration, and public acceptance. It recommends and aims for areas of further study to build on this scope. For LR, this work reframes the challenge as one of structured assurance and readiness rather than speculation. The study set out to investigate the safety and regulatory considerations and to identify any associated barriers for a nuclear-powered vessel performing a port stay in the EU. The Port of Rotterdam made an excellent candidate as one of the largest ports in the world and already operates an extensive regime of risk management, harbour oversight, and communication programs amongst agencies and local communities. Their experience with hazardous fuels and materials has developed the framework and resources necessary to address other types of hazards. The assessment utilised the Rotterdam Harbour Master's existing safety framework as the basis, considering impacts on nearby ships, terminal workers, and simultaneous operations, amongst other scenarios and safety topics addressed. The study vessel was a Maersk V-class with approximately 16 megawatts total power, operating under normal conditions, and did not consider refueling, maintenance activity, security, or nuclear safety incidents during the stay. This work identified gaps in existing regulatory and policy frameworks that would need to be addressed. For example, port emergency response procedures currently don't include incidents from nuclear merchant ships, and would therefore need to be updated in association with national nuclear regulator and environment agency alignment to address this. They're shown here arranged by near-term activities that may be initiated right away and medium-term activities that need to be addressed prior to first operation. Three primary themes are identified by the colours in the figure. The turquoise shows public engagement, the light green technical maturity through engineering assessments, risk management activities informing regulatory and policy development based on technology, and then purple, the international codes and standards development for safe design and operations, including guidance to nations on best practices and recommendations. The long-term activities are related to growing from a first of the kind to nth of a kind nuclear ship deployment at scale. The key findings include that existing port safety and risk management frameworks provide a credible starting point for the assessment of nuclear-powered commercial vessels within the defined case study scenario. That further work is needed on regulatory alignment, governance, emergency preparedness, security and safeguards, liability and insurance, operational integration and public engagement before routine commercial operations could be contemplated. And that current IMO provisions relating to nuclear-powered ships were developed for an earlier era and require modernization to support any future civil nuclear propulsion pathway. Note that the findings are not port-specific, and major ports and maritime member states may play an important role in shaping how nuclear propulsion is assessed and potentially integrated into future shipping strategies. Finally, from an assurance perspective, the JB was a consortium of credible and relevant SMEs, with LR providing expertise in safety and regulatory assurance. The study used a structured assessment methodology, focusing on port operations in a risk-based framework. Early engagement with authorities and transparent risk management will build confidence and develop a pathway to operational readiness. So whilst ports will ultimately need international guidance on technical and operational safety, local and regional initiatives to participate in technology development, develop their own safety strategies, and to engage with the public are all necessary first steps to inform this process, and these can start now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. Thanks for the introduction, Charlotte. I think what we've just heard does represent an important development in the conversation around maritime nuclear. Something that Morgan mentioned earlier, I very much agree with, was that discussions around nuclear-powered shipping, and of course this is a propulsion piece rather than power generation, often can get a little bit stuck on reactor technology itself. But I think what this joint development project did, or has done, is to ask a slightly different question, in the sense that if a nuclear-powered commercial vessel arrived at a major European port, what would actually need to happen for it to be received sort of safely and responsibly? So the value of this work really is that it sort of moves that discussion on a step further on the journey from theory into implementation. And the conclusion, as Richard said, is that not that every question has been answered, because clearly there's still much work to do in several areas, and we'll get into that in a moment. But the study does suggest that many of the challenges are understandable, they're manageable, and importantly, they're already being worked on collaboratively across industry. So with that in mind, we're going to hear directly now from some of the organisations involved. The first theme I'd like to explore with the panel is their view really around timing and outcomes. So in simple terms, why did we do this now, and what did the study tell us? So Françoise, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay. Rotterdam's participation in this project has sort of been about understanding future operational requirements rather than obviously advocating for any particular technology pathway. But obviously, as an aside, feel free to indicate where you want to be considered in Joe Savidio's categorization earlier of leading, following, etc. But I guess my question I want to address to you is, from the port's perspective, why was it important to engage in this work now? Obviously well before any commercial nuclear-powered ships are actually operating.
Thank you very much, Tobi. What we consider as Port of Rotterdam is we look into the new fuels. We look into what can be done, what should be done with regard to also growing into net zero framework. And what we absolutely have as a vision also from our port is looking into technology agnostic. So what we do see, of course, and everyone is seeing that at this moment, the nuclear is a new development. And what we do as Port of Rotterdam is looking into these new developments, innovations, because also we consider ourselves as an innovative and energy hub, specifically, of course, with regard to Europe, but also worldwide, because we are a corridor with a lot of other ports to make transport possible, but also with regard to looking into what does it mean with regard to looking into the decarbonization of the shipping. So that is absolutely something from which we consider it needed to also look into it from a port perspective is what does it mean to us? It is mentioned, as you also mentioned, Richard, it's pre-feasible. So it's really a desk research in what does it mean, how should we look into it, and that's the reason also for us to look into this new technology, this new development, and really being part of this project, having issues, complex issues as well on the table, to start a discussion. What could it mean for a port to prepare?
Okay, thanks, Françoise. Turning to you now, Scott, if I can. As people will have heard today, we regularly argue at Core Power that there's a need to develop that entire maritime nuclear ecosystem, not just the reactors. So sticking with this theme of timing, what does this project tell us about the state of readiness today across that wider ecosystem, do you think?
Well, I think one of the things that this study has indicated is, there are processes in place right now for alternative fuels to come into ports, and the Port of Rotterdam has been exploring that with a lot of the alternative fuels. And nuclear is another one of the alternative fuels that they're looking at. And so I think what it shows is the collaboration of the developers like Core Power. As we interact with the reactor developers, we also need to be interacting with the ports and make sure that we've got all of the connectivity and the support mechanisms that we need for that to happen. So it's important to be engaged early and often with that. So that's my general take is, it's excellent to be able to get the opportunity to work with, Port of Rotterdam for this.
Thank you. Renate, I'll come to you next. I think one of the report's sort of central conclusions is that the challenges are less about the engineering and more about that governance piece, the regulation, development of safety frameworks, which I know is your area of specialty, as well as, of course, that public acceptance piece that we've heard so much about today. So from a port operator's perspective, I just want to sort of get an understanding of what findings stood out most strongly to you.
Thank you. First of all, I like to say, or what I find very interesting during the project is that there is a difference between the nuclear sector and we as a port, because you see that the nuclear sector is very confident about the safety of a reactor, and we as a port, we need evidence for the safety, because that safety we need to assess our system, our safety in our port, and also to the accountability to the environment and to the citizens. So that was for me, very interesting. What we also noticed is that the framework or the existing way of assessing risks is also applicable to the nuclear reactors or to nuclear propelled ships, because we have a lot of experience with chemicals and handling with chemicals or other risks in our ports. So, those assessments we can use also on our nuclear propelled ships. The most challenging thing we saw in this project was the governance, because, we've noticed that there are a lot of authorities involved and they have to work together. And so at this moment there is no, we don't have an idea who is responsible for what. So that's for us.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting point you make about the leveraging of that experience. And I think that sort of leads me on to a question for you, Richard. You outlined this a bit in your keynote, but I'd like to explore it a little bit further if we can. The study also concluded that many of the methodologies already used for new fuels can be applied to this type of ship. How significant is that finding in your opinion? And where do you still see the biggest gaps that need to be addressed?
I always think it's worth recognizing that the safety case concept was pioneered in the nuclear industry and has subsequently been adopted and developed for other industries, other hazardous industries around the world. These sort of goal-based regimes, risk-based methodologies have become best practice and are now being utilized back in the maritime industry for alternative fuels. So therefore, I think they come with credibility and acceptance amongst industry and regulators, which is, is a good starting point. But they do need to be adapted for nuclear. There are considerations, notably in security and safeguards.
Absolutely. That kind of leads into the second theme I wanted to look at, which is in some ways it's the most important. theme is what needs to happen next, right, in the shorter term. Scott, I'll come to you with this one if I can. Obviously, the report's identified, or the roadmap identified, actions across various work streams. That includes regulation, licensing, insurance, training, and public engagement. If you survey those work streams, where do you think industry should focus first if we want to maintain what momentum's already been built up?
Well, I mean, I think the industry needs to engage. I mean, I hate to say all of the above, but it is a bit of that. I mean, but primarily, industry has been starting to focus with the regulatory bodies through the NGOs like NEMO. So we have been doing that, and we're starting to interact with the insurance industries. So all that needs to continue. But we've got to, be engaged with all of the stakeholders that are out there, such as the ports, and to keep the momentum going. I mean, ultimately, what we need is, as you'd mentioned earlier, with the governance and who is in charge of this sort of thing. So we need to work with the governments to identify I'll call it the belly button, that is ultimately responsible for that. So,
okay. Richard, I'm going to come back to you, and this kind of links back a little bit to the timing theme earlier, but one of the interesting observations from the study I thought was that ports and regulators don't necessarily need to wait for that complete international harmonization that we've spoken about to happen before beginning practical preparation. So from a regulatory perspective, and particularly from your Outlook classification, what are some of the actions that organizations could start taking tomorrow?
I think focusing, and similar to Scott's point, focusing on bringing the right stakeholders together to enable deployment. Early engagement with the national authorities is also going to be critical. Introducing real projects, realistic projects, and real technology demonstrations, recognizing that the first movers are going to have to demonstrate at a trial basis at the national and regional levels initially.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to come back to that word experience, Françoise, if we can. So sticking with what needs to happen next, ports are obviously already gaining experience around new fuels, hydrogen-based fuels, ammonia, methanol, etc. Are there lessons, I assume there are, but from those transitions that can help inform how we approach nuclear-powered shipping in the future?
Yes, absolutely. As you also mentioned, we are prepared already for quite some fuels. If you look at the LNG, the methanol, the ethanol also at this moment, but also we have prepared for the ammonia, and that's still very much ongoing. And maybe to be said is what we learn also, and that can be used also for other ports, but also to be looked into, I would say, from other stakeholders. What we have in an international level, we have a preparedness level under the IPH, International Association of Ports and Harbors. We already developed a methodology, I would say, how to get prepared from a port perspective. And I would point out is also we use that now. It's the first steps because it's growing into 9 levels, just as the technology readiness levels. We covered more or less how can it be used by ports. And we are really in the beginning from a port perspective, but it already gives some guidance in what kind of steps should be taken. And also already being mentioned by Renate. One of those aspects is what aspects to look into, for example, from safety, but also what should be looked into from a governance aspect. And those general rules are already applicable. I would say make use of them. Though also as an add-on because of the nuclear aspect, of course. So we have some add-ons with regard to the safety framework to be looked into, more complex. Because we have the maritime, we have the nuclear, we have the complexities, who's responsible for what. Also, we already starting the discussion with our governance on the national level, but also the regulator on the national level. So it is adding additional aspects to be looked into. And that's also what we found out in the working together in this the specific projects. So that's absolutely already a lesson learned that we take along. And hopefully also from the report that other ports can take along, but also other stakeholders to look into what kind of aspects we learned from the joint cooperation in this project with but also as well, looking forward to the agenda, what is going to happen from a nuclear perspective. So yes, lessons learned, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Final question then, I think, final individual question, then we'll look to round up. I want to stay with the port perspective because one of the findings from the JDP was, and this is a similar question that I asked Richard, but Renate, I'd like to get your take on it. One of the findings was that many of the existing safety assessment procedures, specifically that are used for other high consequence activities, let's call it that, can also be applied to nuclear-powered vessels. I wondered if you could explain what that actually means in practice for us and how a port would actually begin assessing a new future nuclear ship.
Yes, well, Françoise already mentioned the port readiness level. So that's something other ports can use. It's open for other ports to use, and we also developed the Harbour Master Safety Framework. You also mentioned it, and there's those. It's something like a flowchart, and well, it's not completely like a flowchart, but you have to tick the boxes, and afterwards, if you have ticked all the boxes, then you can say that the ship can come safe in your port. But it has 11 assessment criteria, and it's like SIMOPS and also the external safety. So you have to look at all those criteria, and you have to do some research, you do some risk assessments, and that will point out if you need any requirements or any requirements.
Okay, that's great. I think that gives us a very good practical perspective of how it would work. Thank you. Okay, so we've sort of talked about why this study matters, what the study found, and some of the practical steps that need to happen next. I'd just like to finish with a very, very brief rapid-fire round from each of you, so in maximum 1 or 2 sentences only, if possible. What's the single most action that should happen in the next 2 years, let's say, to prepare Europe for nuclear-powered shipping? I'll come to Françoise and Renate first, and then Richard, and finally Scott.
First, I think because that's what we are doing at this moment, we talk with our national regulations and our ministry, and you need each other to develop the requirements or to decide whether a nuclear ship can enter the port, because we don't know the technology and we don't know what safety involves with the technology, and our nuclear regulator can do. They have more knowledge about it. So I think that is for us and I think for other ports also the first thing to do. Yes.
Okay. Françoise.
Yeah, well, I think it was already mentioned also earlier today. I think two main aspects need to be looked into: the governance, and it was being mentioned by Renate how to do that and what kind of steps to be taken. But also with regard to safety, it's very important. Also, is what exactly is safety? What we said, we have the safety framework, but it's very important also at an early stage of how could you already prepare to look into. What kind of safety aspects are there? What is the complexity given with related to what we learned from other fuels, and what is the add-on with regard to nuclear, and what does it mean with regard to additional aspects to look into additional questions and research that may ask for, is to come to a preparedness level from your port to also know that the safety is guaranteed, I would say, and what exactly does it mean with regard to the possible giving the possibility to enter to a port, I would say, looking from that aspect.
Okay. Richard, very briefly, if you've got 1 or 2 sentences on that.
I think we're seeing a lot of the right activities starting to happen already. We'd like to see more of the public and private investment in both technology and the supply chain development. Also social investment with communities of end users calling out for adoption of this technology and being picked up by local leaders committing to deployment in reasonable timeframes.
Okay, fantastic. And finally, Scott.
Yeah, I think the most important thing over the next 2 years is to get the clear use cases, get them in front of regulators with a tangible product in front of them, because I think we can sit here and talk quite a bit, but until we have an actual discrete platform to present to the regulators and to the general public, then we're just going to keep talking. It's time to actually do something and proceed.
Okay, thank you. I see Charlotte hovering. So I'd like to sincerely thank Lloyd's Register, Port of Rotterdam, and my colleagues at Core Power for their contributions both to the project itself and to this panel. Thank you.